goes awry. All right, here we go. Welcome back to the county seat. We are having a conversation today about Senate Bill 54, a primary versus caucus. Now, it almost sounds like a slug-out match of some sort in a boxing ring, but not really. We have two distinguished visitors with us today to take each side of the issue. Dave Owen, who is of Owen Communications. He is a consultant for the Count My Vote. Jonathan Johnson, who's a sponsor of Keep My Voice, the other side of the coin, who's also president of
Medici Ventures.
Medici Ventures. Sounds like medicine and Da Vinci all wrapped up into
There
one.
you go.
All right. Thank you for joining us. So we left the conversation in the last segment just briefly introducing Senate Bill 54 as a compromise. So I want to start by asking each of you, to reach that compromise, what did each side give up? David, what did the Count My Vote people who are seeking that?
Well, the original intent of Count My Vote was to go directly to direct primary elections, eliminating the caucus for purposes of nominating. And we were at a place where we had the gross number of signatures, but there were still all the cleanup that you have to do, which all the initiatives are dealing with this year. And the legislature approached Mike Leavitt and gave him rolled out a package, or they negotiated for a number of days, didn't they? And they kind of came up with this idea of, well, what if we do something that's a hybrid, and we'll keep the caucus convention system, and you can still do signatures to get to the ballot. You can bypass it. We saw a graphic example of that in the 3rd District this last year with John Curtis and Chris Herod and others. And my advice at the time was, don't do it. Go on, press on ahead. And I always like to tell people I have an uncanny ability to get Mike Leavitt to yell at me, and we still remain friends and can play golf together. But I understood it was a matter of having to raise that much money. There was no domestic signature gathering industry at that time, which there is now, which changes the ballgame quite a bit. And so they came up with this kind of hybrid. If I may, I don't mean to go too long. I don't mean to monopolize, but in the intervening years, it's actually proven pretty popular with voters. I do a fair amount of consulting. I've done some market research on this and done some focus groups, conducted them. And it's surprising to me how people just like having both options. So anyway, we'll get to what happened after that, but that's kind of my version.
You asked Chad, what did both sides give up?
Yeah, what did you guys give up for it?
That assumes there's just two sides. There's really a third side that wasn't participating. There was the Count My Vote group that was gathering signatures and had an agenda. Then there was the state legislature that stepped in the middle and made all decisions. And then there were the parties. And the parties were not, and particularly the Republican Party, was not in favor of the compromise. And so when we say, what did the Republican Party give up? The Republican Party had taken away from it the ability to decide how it selects its nominees. And so what happened was the legislature stepped in, passed a bill that said, if you're going to be a party in Utah, you're going to select nominees, you can use one of two ways. You can use the neighborhood caucus convention system, and you must use the signature gathering
Must
system.
allow, anyway.
Must allow.
Yeah. So may I say one thing? I remember the night that we gathered after a meeting of their board and everything, and it was a small group in Governor Leavitt's office. And the big get for him was there are two paths to the ballot. And he regarded that as a win. That was a W. So he was willing to accept that and forego the rest of what was originally planned with Count My Vote.
So I guess I'll kind of redirect this question. What do you see, Jonathan, as the advantage to a straight caucus system where people start in the caucus and go through the nominating process to convention? I will ask you the same in primaries after. So Jonathan, you go first.
So I've participated in the caucus convention system in two different roles. One is a delegate who was elected by my neighbors to vet candidates, talk to them, decide which one to choose. The other way I've participated is a candidate. I ran for governor and spent a lot of time meeting with, answering questions of, and courting state delegates. I think the real virtue of the caucus system is it provides accountability for candidates. They can't just put out glossy brochures. They can't just run expensive television ads. They've got to meet with voters one-on-one, and in particular, educated voters who are representing their neighborhood, and answer their questions, and they'll be held accountable for how they vote. I think that's a really important part of a representative republic, which is what we are.
Now, I've said that I'm from Owen Communications advisor to Count My Vote because I don't want to. I'm very careful about speaking for them. And now you're going to hear something from me that you won't hear from them.
Okay.
And I've said this from the get-go. Everybody's overstating here. I've said this to Rich McKeon and Mike Levitt. I've said it to folks that are on the caucus convention side of things, a number of my friends that are mutual friends, as a matter of fact. And I've said everybody's overstating. You guys are overstating the bad that's going to happen. My guys over here are overstating the good. Because in reality, the legislature, for example, is going to be as conservative as the people. I happen to have just as Jonathan's had a couple different views on this, I lobby up in Wyoming. Also, I have lobbied in Idaho. I can promise you that those two legislatures are every bit as conservative, if not more so than the Utah state legislature. In my mind, Idaho and Utah, you could put them on buses and switch them and nobody would notice. Wyoming's a little different because they have very different processes and procedures and rules up there. But I would say that body's more conservative than the Utah legislature. In Wyoming right now, if I want to, I go down to the county seat and file and give them $25 and file to run against you, you're my legislator, and I'm in a primary. That's all it takes. And yet somehow it works itself out and people make the selections, and no, it's not just rich and famous people. That always makes me laugh. And in Idaho, they actually do have signatures, but it's like 100 signatures or something like that. It's kind of token. And then you pay. So in my mind, everybody's overstating the effect of this. I think in the end, we're probably going to have a legislature very similar to the one we have now. We're probably going to have the same governor that we would have had anyway, and so on and so forth. The reason I care is that if I'm going to err on the side of more participation in giving people more voice. And so that's just that's a personal thing for me, that I believe in that. I believe in little d democracy.
So,
and I've watched the convention system go rogue too many times.
well, and I mean, it has the potential, but I would suppose also a primary election with a hotly contested, slogan-based competition could probably go a little bit rogue as well.
I always tell people, ask Eric Cantor whether you can get taken out in a primary. I mean, he was slated to be the next speaker. You know, he's home mowing his lawn right now, and a very little-known, underfunded college professor beat him. And that drives a lot of the votes in Congress, is their fear of going home and getting primaried. I might add that Texas is very similar to what I'm talking about. You pay a fee and you get some signatures, but it's not anything like what we do.
Okay, I believe
pretty conservative state.
Yeah, and I believe that the reason Utah is consistently held to be one of the best managed states in the country is we have a system that holds our people accountable. And
it's called democracy.
We live in a republic, it's a republic.
But
and
it's still the democratic function that holds them accountable.
Dave, I appreciate your opinion, and I listened carefully to it. What I would say is that the difference in a republic, like we have in the U.S. and like we have under the caucus convention system, is that people are elected to represent others. And those that are representing, I think, take their role very seriously. Here's an example. When I was a candidate, and prior to the convention, I would hold a teletown hall. I would call delegates, and they would listen. They would listen for a long time, and they would ask question after question after question. During the primary, when I would hold a teletown hall, I could have just as many or many more people on the phone call that wouldn't ask a single question. Wouldn't ask a single question for an hour long. I think that when people know that they are representing their neighbors, they take it seriously. And I think it's part of the reason that Utah does so well as a state compared to others.
Well, that's the other thing that I brought up since the last session. I keep asking people, where is this bastion of conservative purity that you people claim. I mean, we expanded Medicaid under Obamacare up there this year. We had a $700 million surplus, and we voted $240 million in tax increases. They caved into the Our Schools Now people and gave them a package that is many times what's been indicated in the bill. It's a lot more money than that. So I'm trying to figure out where this pure conservative...
I'm not taking the position that the caucus convention system breeds a more liberal or a more conservative system.
But that's generally the point, isn't it?
It's not. No, it's not the point. It's the point. That may be the point of some that you've talked to among our mutual friends, but I think the real point is representative government. And what I continue to hear from the other side is that the caucus convention system breeds a harder right or a harder left group of people. Having sat in so many county conventions and so many state conventions, sure, I've seen people that are hardcore Tea Partiers wearing trifold hats, and I've sat next to people that I thought were very, very moderate Republicans. I think it breeds a cross-section of society that's focused on doing what their neighborhood wants.
You do bring a point that I think is worthy of conversation here, and that is the claim that that you have a flyover effect. And obviously this program is called the county seat, so we look at our issues at a county altitude. And so there's some impact on county elections, and I know that the impacts of the dual system or the preferences for caucus or primary differs where you are in the state. But is that flyover factor, if you're looking at primaries where you're only at a statewide race looking at the total number of votes, does that not have the potential of excluding the points of view of the less populated portions of the state?
I honestly don't believe it does any more than is the case now. I mean, I still think that elections play out. I mean, the representative republic thing, how far do you want to take that? I mean, do you want to vote for the people who get to vote for the people who vote for the people who select the candidates? You know, I don't want to go to that. I think the best way, I've seen too many examples. I remember when we were doing this the first time around, and I was doing some work down in Orem. And there was a guy that was the blue blood Chamber of Commerce odds-on favorite, had lots of money, all this kind of stuff. There's a guy named Dick Brunst. Do you happen to know Dick? He's the mayor down there. He and another council member went and walked and probably knocked, if they didn't knock every door in Orem, it wasn't because they didn't try. And they did it a couple of times. And they outworked and out-talked and stood on the doorsteps of enough voters that this guy beat the guy, this odds-on favorite with all the funding, and beat him, and he's still the mayor of Orem as far as I know. And I think it's really just, it's all the same fundamentals. And again, I would say, if everybody else in the world were doing it the way we were, and they were getting a better result, then I might see some reason in it. But the fact is, most states are what we're going to. There's a signature, the caucus will still have an influence. But
you asked a question about flyover counties in the state. It's interesting how Dave answered it. He talked about a city election in Orem. He did not talk about
it was a city election, Jonathan.
A city election in Orem.
It's a limited election.
Sure, but the question was, are we going to create flyover counties? And I think under the Count My Vote system, we absolutely will. There are 25 largely rural counties off the Wasatch Front. I don't know why someone running for a statewide office would spend their time not focusing on the 2 million people on the Wasatch Front, because that's enough to win. And it's important that those that represent the state understand what people in Juab County care about, or San Juan County, or Duchesne County. And the motivation to go there when you're dealing with delegates who are going to get you elected is a big, big deal. And I think that's why keep my voice in this representative government is really important.
And are you suggesting that the governor of Texas pays no attention to the rural areas of Texas? Are you suggesting that the mayor of Iowa or the governor of Iowa doesn't take good care to go to those farming communities and get to know people?
Here's what I'm talking about Utah. I'm talking about Utah, where we have a unique population along a small, maybe 60, 70 mile corridor at most of I-15. It's a thin, small corridor. I'm not talking about Texas and Iowa. I'm talking about Utah and what's best for Utah. You know, if I'm up in Brigham City, I want to make sure that my statewide representatives come up and court my vote and care and learn about my issues. I think that's important.
And in my opinion, a smart candidate will always do that. If it's a blowout, I guess maybe somebody gets lazy and doesn't go to all 29 counties or something like that. But if it's a contested primary, I think it's a pretty stupid candidate who doesn't do his or her homework, and get to all the places where they need to go to make sure that they do understand those issues. I just think it's fundamental politics.
Next question. One of the claims is it's way more expensive to become a candidate and run to the primary and primarily advertises your way to connect with delegates if you're straight primary. What your response to that?
Well, I think that's right, and I think Dave mentioned it earlier in an answer that we now have developed a industry that collects signatures. Why have we done that? Because frankly, people couldn't collect the signatures without paying someone to do it. So now if you're running for a statewide office and have to collect 28,000 signatures at whether that's $2 or $4 a pop, you're talking tens, if not $100,000 to do that. That's a significant hurdle for
Jonathan,
many,
as you
many
well
people.
know, when the Count My Vote initiative passes, those signature thresholds will be lowered considerably.
Where are they today with 54? And, you know, look, I'm someone who chose to run, and part of the reason I didn't gather signatures, one of the reasons, was the cost.
I agree with you on that.
Principally, I don't like the idea, but I think it's going to prohibit a lot of people from participating in the system.
And see, I think under the proposed initiative, those numbers go down to much more manageable levels. And in fact, if I had invested a lot of money in a signature gathering company, I might be worried about that right now, because I think it will be much more manageable on the, certainly. I don't tend to only think of the headline offices, you know, the statewide offices. I tend to think an awful lot about the local and the legislator and the senator, the state senator and so forth. And at this point, you're right about SB 54 as it stands right now. That will change after the, and that was interesting. That came out in that opinion that was just issued by the 10th Circuit.
And I will note, where politics is local, the smaller the district you're in, the more grassroots politicking, campaigning you're going to need. So when we talk about a mayor in Orem or a county commissioner in a relatively small rural county, of course they're going to knock on every door they can. But in a state as large as Utah, and trust me, I've been from top to bottom and side to side in my old GMC Yukon. It's hard to knock on every door in Utah. It's really hard, if not impossible.
Well, you can't. You can't knock on every door in Utah. But I've, been a part of statewide campaigns and congressional campaigns and so forth. And I'm just saying that the better the candidate, the harder the worker. And they do tend to get out there and talk to the people.
Okay, I want to throw another question out here. If you talk on the street, people say that this entire primary drive happened because of Bob Bennett in the Senate and Mike Lee. That's what I hear. So I would like to hear both of you, your perspective on that.
Well, let me say this. I kind of broke into politics in 1992 when a guy named Mike Levitt, who lived in my neighborhood, decided to run for governor, and that was kind of where I got an awful lot of grounding in the campaign world, and this stuff eventually became my livelihood, for better or for worse. And I remember him talking about that back in like 94. 93, and I don't think he was the only one. I think Bennett was certainly a precipitating event. It called a lot of people's attention to it, and it brings up some interesting questions of political philosophy. On one hand, it's good that an incumbent can be voted out of office. I think that's healthy and good, and the way it ought to be. What offended people was that the people of Utah, and by the way, Bob Bennett got hit by a bus, that year. If you understand the political dynamic that was coming together, it was a perfect storm. And so he walks into convention and gets eliminated, and offended a lot of voters here in Utah who said, wait a minute, I may have wanted to get rid of him, but I wanted to get rid of him. I didn't want a small group of people that happened to show up on a Saturday morning to do it for me. And so it's an interesting thing, whether that's good or bad. I personally think it was probably in the long run not a good thing. And that's not anything against Senator Lee.
So when I think of governor and then Secretary Leavitt, he was a great beneficiary of the caucus convention system. That's how he was elected. When Mike Lee was running, I went to my neighborhood caucus meeting held at a junior high school, and it was very clear to me, as I was elected as state delegate, that my neighbors wanted someone else. They wanted someone else. And I think that would have been very difficult for a sitting incumbent senator in that special club that is the U.S. Senate to be removed without the caucus convention system. And so I think that the Count My Vote and then SB 54 arose from that very election.
So here's another thing that we haven't cleared up so far in the show. When I read accounts about this in the press and this whole process going forward, the argument that comes out is that Utah, with its caucus and convention system, is unique. And it's the only place in the country, the only place in history that it's been. And so I'm wondering, when you relate that to national parties still running conventions to select their candidates, even though there are primaries in the lower levels of that, is that a correct statement, that the caucus systems have been eliminated everywhere in the country and that we are unique? Because both the Deseret News, the Tribune, Standard Examiner, and the Provo Herald have all made that statement in print.
Well, there are elements of the caucus convention system as it was practiced in Utah prior to SB 54 that were unique. But the overall, Iowa's a caucus state, Nevada's a caucus state. That's the selection method for presidential candidates. Some of them vary from that when it comes to state and local candidates. Others have something fairly similar. I know that in Wyoming, for example, because I've experienced there, the convention does matter, and how the delegates vote and who they endorse does matter in the local elections. It's just not binding the way it was here. So I think we are probably the last vestige of the specifics of that system.
So it's not like we're unique because we were unique originally. We've become unique because everybody's migrated from it.
And I know that there are efforts in California to move back to something closer to the caucus convention system. Whether it will work or not in a state like that, I don't know. But I think there are folks that are so frustrated with the open, direct primary system there and how it's changed politics in California that they'd like to move something closer to what we're doing.
Now, let's not use California as an example.
Well, if we use them as an example of going wrong and wanting to come more like us, I think it's a good example. If we are peculiar, we should be pleased.
Okay. So, final thoughts. We'll start with you, Dave.
Well, I was struck, I can't remember what cycle it was, and I didn't do a good job of keeping contemporaneous notes, as people want to say these days. But there was a congressman, I believe it was a Republican, and he lost his election. And in the post-election interview, he made the statement on camera, the voters can never be wrong. The voters can never be wrong. And he was accepting his defeat and saying that I may disagree with them, and I may think they've made a bad decision, but they can't be wrong because that's the way they voted. And I guess I'm a believer in that the voters are accountable, the voters are responsible. For me, the caucus convention system is too exclusive, too many people. There's the problems of attendance, but there's also the problems of personality. I can imagine my wife, who is English and is actually the last presidential election was her first. She became a naturalized citizen just immediately before that. And I cannot imagine her going to one of the more rambunctious caucus meetings in this state. Probably in our neighborhood, it probably wouldn't be a big problem. My point is that people aren't willing to go, that aren't like us, willing to kind of stand up and, yell a little bit, are intimidated and they don't feel free to go there. And so for me, it's just simpler, easier. Let's go campaign. Let's show up, when the ballots go out or the polls are open on Tuesday, and do it that way. And to me, I'm going to err on the side of more participation.
I find that a puzzling statement because you said your wife's from England. Hasn't she ever been to Parliament? I mean, that's a pretty raucous bunch of guys.
Oh, yeah.
And gals. Your turn.
She's never run, I can tell you that.
This is what I would say. This is a First Amendment issue, a freedom of association issue. We're talking about political parties deciding how they will nominate their candidates who then will participate in an election where the voters can't be wrong. But for the voters to tell the political parties how they must do their personal business is a freedom of association issue. And that's why the Keep My Voice initiative is titled the Freedom of Association Initiative.
All of that is fine. All of that is valid until you bring into the fact that the taxpayers pay for the primary election. And at the point that this private association elects to take public money, as we all know, that comes with strings. And therefore, if you were willing to go out and fund those elections and, fund everything about getting your candidate on the ballot, I suppose that might work out. But where we're holding statewide elections and the state of Utah runs them and the lieutenant governor is responsible for them and the taxpayer pays for them, that I'm afraid mitigates your claim.
Strings. The great puppet master has spoken. we should act like sovereign individuals, sovereign parties, not like puppets being pulled by the strings of the elite of this state.
Gentlemen, very good debate. Thank you very much both for attending.
You,
My
Chad.
pleasure. Thanks for
Appreciate
having
Thank
us.
you.
Now, usually I just tell people, if you want to go back and watch the extended version of this, go back and do so. I'm encouraging everybody watching today to go back and see this entire conversation. It's very illuminating. And I did not say Illuminati-ating. It's just to keep conspiracy. Yeah. Anyway, stay with us. We'll be back with more of the county seat for some final thoughts and our tour of the ground when we meet with a candidate who's run under both systems, and we'll see how it affects his campaigning this very day. We'll be back with the county seat in just a minute.